Nowhere has that been more evident than in the war in Ukraine. What else have they done? You said a lot of them have military backgrounds or some kind of affiliation. What have they been doing? Is it more logistical? Have they actually been fighting directly on the front lines?
It's not been entirely easy for them. Most of them came over.
What do you expect the role of these volunteers to be in looking ahead to the next year or whatever short to medium term, and how instrumental will they be?
I think they will probably just carry on largely as they have done. The Ukrainian military never says exactly how many are there, so we don't really have any idea of whether there is still the same number there or whether there's a sort of dwindling force. As far as I can see, there's not much effort by the Ministry of Defence in the UK. Tell us what you know, what's it like to fight the Russians, what's it like to face these drones and the artillery and all just the general psychological onslaught that you must get.
This is The Global Gambit.
One of the things that we learn a lot about wars is the amount of volunteering, the amount of people that will drop suddenly their lives to go and support those who are fighting for an important cause. Nowhere has that been more evident than in the war in Ukraine, where since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, have been tens of thousands of volunteers, people who have committed their lives to helping the Ukrainians resist Putin's war machine. And someone who has done an extensive set of coverage on that, including in their new book, is Colin Freeman. Colin is a veteran British journalist known for fearless frontline reporting, and, well, he's been in conflict zones from, to be honest, I can't even keep up. When I met Colin earlier last week, we had a lovely conversation, and I learned just how much of a field experience he has from the Middle East and to Ukraine as well. And, well, this conversation is about that and Colin's new book, The Mad and the Brave, the untold story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion. Colin, it's lovely to have you on the show.
Hello.
And I'm very curious to understand initially what propelled you to write the book.
Well, I was out in Ukraine covering the war anyway for the Daily Telegraph, the newspaper that I've worked for on and off as a foreign correspondent for most of the last 20 years. And I was in Kiev during the siege of Kiev, and I think it was around that point that we first got wind that there were foreign volunteers turning up to fight for Ukraine. This followed an appeal by President Zelensky on day 3 of the war, which, if you track back to that time, you remember was when he really was holed up in his bunker and things looked really, really tough for Ukraine. And he issued this appeal for any foreigner anywhere around the world who had military experience to come and help defend Ukraine. And he said, this was not just a fight to defend Ukraine. This was a fight to defend democracy and freedom and human rights in Europe. He couched it in those terms, and that clearly caught the imagination of a lot of people. And I think within about a fortnight, according to the Ukrainian authorities, they had something like 20,000 applications to sign up. Not everybody did actually turn up. That's something we can come to later, but it clearly captured the imagination of the world. And within a couple of weeks, you had fighters or volunteer fighters coming in from literally, I think in the end, about 52 different countries within the first few weeks, turning up in places like Kiev and so on. And I was fascinated to know what was motivating them to come and fight, because it was obvious to the world, and particularly obvious to me at that time, that this was not like a small localized war. This was grown-up warfare of a sort that we had not known since World War II, really. And certainly the British volunteers who were coming over, this would be war of a scale that they had never known before. Nothing like fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan under NATO or coalition forces where you've got all the aces. This time you would be the underdog, and you'd be going up against a superpower, the second superpower in the world, Vladimir Putin's Russia, with all that entailed. So it was quite an undertaking. I was curious just to know what motivated people who just days before would have been leading an ordinary life, doing ordinary civilian jobs, and suddenly were contemplating really throwing themselves into the thick of it.
Yeah, well, you've reported from Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and obviously Ukraine more recently. So why do you think, maybe you've touched upon it in your initial answer, but why do you think that Ukraine was such a magnet? because of the scale and severity of it, because it was more publicized being, a global North war compared to global South conflicts, or any other particular reasons?
I think first and foremost, it was the perceived justness of the cause. Most of the people who have joined up for the Legion, with a very few exceptions, are not people who would have just gone and volunteered for any war just so that they could go and fight for kicks. They're not going to get involved in a civil war or a religious war or an ethnic war. They were only going to go in and get involved in this kind of war where, as far as they perceived it, there was a clear villain and a clear innocent party. This was a naked land grab by Vladimir Putin, an unprovoked attack on a democracy, and also a place in their backyard, relatively speaking, certainly for the Europeans among them, the Brits, all the people who volunteered from places like the Baltics, France, Italy, Spain, and I think a lot of them felt this has comparisons with Hitler's early land grabs at the start of World War II, and that if ever they were going to go and fight in a war, this was going to be the one to do. And quite a lot of them are ex-soldiers. I'd say the majority of these people who volunteer are ex-soldiers, and a lot of them feel like, I've got all these skills that I've spent years training for, and if I don't put them into practice now, really, what's the point of being a soldier? So that was the guiding motivation for a lot of them. However, it's not a small thing, obviously, to give up a normal civilian life in the West to go and fight in that kind of conflict, to risk your life. And a lot of them, while the cause is one justification, there's usually other justifications as well, personal justifications. Some of them are ex-soldiers who've never fought before, who signed up for the military before, while at the time when the Iraq and Afghan campaigns, for example, for the Brits, were winding down. And I think a lot of them felt like, I want to see whether I can actually handle conflict. I want to see the chance. I want to get the chance to put my skills into practice and see whether I'm up to the task. Because soldiering is very unusual in that respect. It's not like other professions. Like you can learn for years all the skills and never get the chance to put them into practice. It's like being a surgeon who never goes and operates, or a journalist who never writes a story for a real newspaper, or anything like that, or a pianist who never gets to actually play a concert. So there is that aspect to it. For some of the combat veterans, people who had already fought in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, I think there was the lure of seeing what it was like to deploy against a peer army where, as I said earlier, you don't hold all the aces, where your combat skills are potentially tested to their limits. And then for other people, the reasons are even more personal than that. Quite a lot of the volunteers freely admit that they didn't have terribly happy home lives. Often, as ex-soldiers, they have difficulty adjusting to life on Civvy Street as civilians, and they miss the camaraderie and the order of army life, and also the excitement of being deployed in combat. It's like a second family for a lot of them, and this was an opportunity to revisit that world. And then I think for a minority, especially some of the ones who were perhaps had never fought before, and there are a few, it was a sense, I think, perhaps of just almost ennui, like boredom at life in the West, and that they wanted to feel that they wanted to do something challenging in life, of the sort that perhaps their forefathers had faced in maybe World War II or other conflicts, where to test their mettle and see if they're up to that kind of thing. And here was a chance, a really serious chance, to see whether you're made of the stuff that your ancestors were.
Well, it sounds like quite a eclectic set of reasons, and some very personal, as much as it is about the idealism or symbolism of supporting Ukraine. But as the war has gone on, there's obviously been questions about the sustainability of the whole war. But how much has volunteers, Legion, been in ensuring that sort of morale has been maintained? How much has the foreign influx of fighters been an important aspect?
Statistically, I don't think they've come in sufficient numbers quite to be a game changer in the war. Even if we say that, for example, 20,000 foreign volunteers turned up, including some very experienced NATO-trained soldiers, in a war where you've got roughly 500,000 combatants on either side, depending on what stats you use. That's not enough to be a game changer. However, in terms of morale, I think the contribution has been reasonably significant. Ordinary Ukrainians see foreigners coming in, not just to deliver aid or to work in medical centres, as a lot of humanitarian volunteers do, but to actually risk their lives and fight alongside them. And that, I think, is an important signal that the world is behind them. And quite a lot of the volunteers I've spoken to say that, when they're walking down the street into a cafe or somewhere, someone will spot the little flags, either American Stars and Stripes, Union Jacks, or some of the other European tricolours, and they'll buy them a coffee, or they'll buy them a drink, or they'll just come up and say thank you. It's nice to see you here. So there is definitely that side of it. I would say the morale is probably the primary contribution, really.
Well, what else have they done? You said a lot of them have military backgrounds or some kind of affiliation. What have they been doing? Is it more logistical? Have they actually been fighting directly on the front lines? Is it, a mixture of things? What sort of the detailed roles that some of them have had, and how maybe they've evolved since the war has evolved?
It's not been entirely easy for them. Most of them came over wanting to actually take part in combat. When they first came over, because the Ukrainian armed forces were already quite overstretched, dealing with a small matter of an invasion, there wasn't really the logistics and organisational capacity in place to get them all properly trained and then sorted out into battalions and then deployed quickly to the front lines. A lot of the volunteers found themselves sitting around, feeling slightly redundant in barracks, being told forever, we'll get you out this month, next month, and things not really happening. And obviously, if you come to fight and risk your life in someone else's war, I think you want to get on with it. You don't want to be waiting around seemingly indefinitely. There were also practical problems of absorbing a polyglot army, people from all around the world, into an army that, where Ukrainian and Russian were the primary languages, and where a lot of people wouldn't speak English. And obviously, if you on a battlefield, if you've got people who don't understand basic commands, if you're shouting in Ukrainian, watch out for that landmine, or don't go over there, or whatever, that's going to be a real problem. Never mind explaining the complexities and nuances of a battlefield plan or something like that. So there were issues with integrating them into the armed forces. What a lot of the volunteers did in the end was effectively sidestep the formal international legion that President Zelensky had set up, which was essentially a kind of recruiting clearinghouse, and formed their own little semi-independent bands of fighters who would then really shop themselves around on the front lines and just try and make informal contacts with different Ukrainian military commanders and say, look, we are here, we have these skill sets, usually in infantry or medics, things like that, and give us a chance, we'll try and prove ourselves to you. And that is kind of the way it worked. But essentially in a slightly piecemeal and dispersed fashion. So you got little units of 12, 24 here, there, and everywhere, rather than big formal battalions of foreigners, as you might otherwise imagine it. And what kind of things do they do? They do reconnaissance work, is a very common thing, which is basically going out into no man's land, crawling and creeping through minefields and disputed territories to get eyes on Russian positions and check out, generally what's going on further ahead. Some of them work as snipers, others as general, sappers, which are clearing landmines, and medics, and often a combination of all those things, really, just doing whatever is needed day to day on the battlefield. And in most cases, I think their contribution is appreciated quite a lot. They have to earn their of the Ukrainian military. Inevitably, there are misunderstandings here, but that's the kind of general sort of stuff they do, yeah. And they bring certain levels of NATO experience to the party sometimes in terms of making good calls on the battlefield. But as with any war, there are ups and downs to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I find very interesting is about the number of countries, the number of different entities involved in this. And one of them that caught the attention, I think, of quite a few was the Freedom of Russian Legion, which is, for people who aren't familiar, it was formed purportedly as part of Ukraine's broader international legion, but it's made up of defectors from the Russian armed forces. Is that something that you encountered? And if so, what were sort of the sentiments there?
No,
Sort of these.
my book is mainly about the Western volunteers who've gone out to join. There are a couple of units. I think they're called the Freedom of Russia Legion and the United Russia Legion. I can't quite remember offhand. Who are made up primarily of former Russian citizens who are now fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians, and did some incursions, I think, into Kursk last year or the year before. I think quite a mixed bag. Some of them are. One of the units, I think, was led by an ex-soccer hooligan who had very far right nationalist tendencies. The other unit, I think, was a bit more mainstream. But what that does prove, though, I think, is that the Ukrainians were pretty much willing to take whatever help they could get, and were not particularly fussy about people's backgrounds, as long as they were willing to help defend Ukraine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how do you think that the volunteers that you've seen here compare to other parts of the world? We've discussed a little bit about their variancy in motivation and experience, but also in terms of other parts of the world and conflicts, because the war in Ukraine has captured the hearts and minds of so many people in the West and many places. So, what are some of your main takeaways, having spent so much time out there?
The only sort of previous time when this has happened in recent history really was during the conflict against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in when they took cities like Mosul and they took over large parts of Syria, and you had Kurdish anti-Islamic State forces issued an appeal for an international brigade to come and help them, again hoping to tap into soldiers with Western NATO expertise, probably ex-POWs and Marines, ex-Navy SEALs, people like that who they felt could teach them something. That was a much smaller mobilization. You're probably looking at maybe a few hundred to 1,000 foreigners getting involved in that. Obviously, the Ukraine mobilization is far, far bigger. Then prior to that, you've really got to go back to the Spanish Civil War, when you had the elected Republican government, a left-leaning socialist government, in the late 1930s, that was the subject of an attempted coup and military takeover by the fascist forces of General Franco. And again, that was a cause that captured the imagination of the world. And there you had something like, I think, about 35,000 volunteers, again from a multiplicity of countries, 50, 60 different countries around the world. The two causes do bear some comparison, and a lot of people felt like that this is an evil force that needs to be stopped, and it's my duty to go and fight. One big difference is, though, that when people signed up for the Spanish Civil War, the majority of them were members of local communist parties in their home countries. Of the Brits, something like 75% were members of communist or socialist parties, who felt that they were doing a bit for the global cause of socialism, to fight up, to stand up against fascism. And they also contributed a lot to the organisation and logistics and transport of getting people out there. And I think if you were in a communist party in those days, wouldn't want to overstate this, but I think there was some subtle degree of peer pressure sometimes among the ranks to kind of go out and do your bit. Whereas in the current conflict in Ukraine, it's a very, very personal choice. None of these people are really generally members of organised movements or political parties that are urging people to go out. It's an entirely individual choice. That's one big difference. In terms of their effectiveness on the battlefield, I think they both have faced the same difficulties of getting there and then finding that it's often slightly chaotic and things are not quite as well run as they should be. And also the strange experience of fighting alongside people that they've never met before, whom they've had no time to gel with in any way.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I also think is I'm kind of curious, I guess, is just the legality of it. Obviously, when you become a combatant, you pick up arms, that changes your designation under international humanitarian law. But how does it work with these sorts of legions when you've got so many of them coming over? Does that change the dynamics there, or because they are volunteering as military personnel for a nation state, like Ukraine, they have the same designation as legitimate members of the Ukrainian armed forces, for example?
The short answer, as I understand it, is that yes, they have legal cover because they are integrated as members of the International Legion into the armed forces of Ukraine. I think sometimes there's been shortcomings in the paperwork, and they haven't necessarily had the paperwork that they should have got to prove that, but that is the general presumption, yes, and therefore they are legitimate combatants who have the entitlement to be treated under the Geneva Convention, yes. They are paid a salary of about $500 a month, $600 a month, which if you're a Western fighter, a Brit or an American, is really not very much at all. You know, you could earn more working on minimum wage in McDonald's or something like that. And that then goes up to quite a bit more than that, about $3,000 a month if you're actually in a combat zone. But that's quite closely monitored as to whether you are. It's only when you're really in the thick of it that you get that money. But it does mean that they are entitled to be seen as legitimate fighters. It doesn't always protect them. In fact, it very rarely protects them when they're captured by the Russians. And several of the people who feature in the book have accounts of being taken prisoner of war by the Russians and then undergoing weeks of very severe torture, interrogation, electrocution, all kinds of horrors, and then being kept as prisoners of war for months on end in very Spartan prisoner of war camps.
Yeah, that's one of the things you discuss is the sort of treatment and some of the experiences of those volunteers who have been captured. Could you expand a little bit more on some of the more wild stories you've heard, but also just how the sort of treatment of POWs are between the Russians and the Ukrainians?
Well, I'll give it for an example. We had one soldier called Alex Druki from the United States. He was an Iraq veteran. He'd actually suffered quite bad PTSD in Iraq and was struggling a bit to find purpose and meaning in his life back in the US. And when the Ukraine war came along, he volunteered. I think initially intending to go out there as a trainer because he'd been a staff sergeant, so he was used to commanding units of 40 or 50 men at a time, 50 soldiers rather, and he felt his main skills would be as a trainer, but he ended up getting involved in combat, and he was on his very first combat mission up in a village outside of Kharkiv, or rather up in woodlands outside of Kharkiv. He went with a mission with about 9 other soldiers, and they ran into a much larger Russian unit that was coming making its way through the same woodlands. Some of them got separated from others. They had to make an agonizing decision at one point because they realized 2 of their number were missing, and it was like, do we stay or do we and try and find our missing comrades, or do we go and just get the hell out and risk leaving them behind? Alex stayed and as a result was cut off from the rest of the unit. Russian troops started coming through the area. He then, with his comrade, walked for about 8 hours through trying to get back towards friendly territory, and in the end was captured by some Russian troops. They had a pretty agonizing moment at one point where it was like, shall we try and fight our way out of this? I think he was up for it. His comrade said, no, I don't want to do this. I want to survive. And they were duly taken prisoner. And cut long story short, they were beaten up a few times initially by the soldiers that captured them, but generally not treated too badly. Things then took a very dark turn when they were taken off by or delivered to the Russian authorities and taken into a black site prison, basically an unofficial jail run by a whole load of Russian intelligence officers, exactly who I don't know. And they were beaten relentlessly, kept in cells where there was constant music playing for 8 hours a day, really, really loud. There was lights on 24 hours in the cell. So noise torture, sleep deprivation, and also subjected to torture by electricity quite a lot as well, with a kind of wind-up field telephone thing that delivers a very powerful electric current charge, isn't it? It's called making a phone call to Putin, apparently, this thing. And he was ushered into a room where there was this chap sat at a desk with this, what looked like a kind of wind-up field telephone. Some wires were attached to his ears and his arm, I think it was, and duly electrocuted several times in a row. Not for very long, only for about a minute, but he said it was, like on a kind of completely different league from any of the other torture he had had, and then constantly interrogated as well. So that lasted more or less non-stop for about 5 weeks. And on the top of that, he also had was told that as a foreign combatant, especially as an American, he would be treated as a mercenary and potentially face the death penalty. So quite how he got through all that, I have no idea. He then spent several months having transferred into a prison with some other foreign volunteers, kind of international, all kept in the same international wing, a bit like something out of The Great Escape. I won't give it away what happens in the end, but that's the kind of treatment that was routine for any foreign volunteer who got captured by the by the Russian armed forces.
Was there a variation of treatment depending upon the nationality of any soldiers that were captured by Russian forces? Was it more antagonistic towards Western name countries like, I don't know, the Anglosphere, like America and Britain versus, say, the Polish, or countries closer to Russia's former sphere of influence?
I'm not sure. I haven't interviewed any soldiers from, like, for example, the Baltic states who have had experience of being held POW. Certainly, I think with the Americans there was I think there was a certain venom excuse me, to the interrogations, and they would be asked, what on earth do you think you're doing over here? And accused of being CIA agents and all that sort of thing. They also, though, were often viewed as potentially valuable chips for prisoner exchanges or for other diplomatic leverage. So while they might have had a rough time in captivity to start off with, your life chances as a POW as an American were probably higher than if you were, say, for example, a Georgian or something like that. But from my general sense is that everybody who is captured by the Russians goes through several weeks of absolute hell first before, in terms of torture and interrogation, just as a routine, really, before then perhaps being transferred to slightly better conditions. And that will happen no matter where you're from.
Mm. Now, as the war has obviously progressed, there's been debate about whether or not it's a protracted conflict, or there is momentum on the battlefield versus the strategic and diplomatic levels of it, perhaps. But how do you think the winter approaching this will play into the mindsets of those who are volunteering, and whether or not there is going to be significant shifts on the battlefield? Do you think that will play into the psyche of those who come over to support Ukraine, or it depends on the bigger picture?
I don't think anybody's particularly expecting any significant shifts on the battlefield as things stand. There doesn't seem to be much prospect of that at the moment. Day to day, as we've seen, the Russians are making very, very small incremental gains, but we're talking about a very small amount of territory. So it's hard to see things really shifting in that respect. The only thing that might happen is if Ukraine makes some kind of technological breakthrough, which doesn't seem particularly imminent. If something happens in Russia, another coup attempt, as we saw with the Wagner coup attempt back in 2023, something like that could make a difference. Or President Trump deciding to pull the weapons plug on Ukraine in some dramatic fashion, but as yet we still haven't seen that either. As regards the volunteers, well, most of those who are fighting now have either been fighting for 2 or 3 years already and are committed to seeing it through. A lot of them are, because if not just for the cause, for the fact that they've lost friends and comrades out there, and they feel they owe it to them to see it through. Any newcomers who are signing up, and there are still people signing up, are going into it, I think, with their eyes more open now, because they know what they're letting themselves in for. They'll have read media accounts, etc. And there's plenty of other people who can fill them in on the details of what it's actually going to be like, what they're letting themselves in for. I think there is one difference from the volunteers' point of view, is that the combat now is a lot tougher or a lot less rewarding as a soldiering experience than it used to be, because the sheer prevalence of drones on the battlefield now, in terms of spy drones, but also in terms of drones that can drop bombs, or FPV drones, the ones that are basically like a suicide drone that will chase soldiers around the battlefield like a predatory wasp or mosquito or something, and then land on them and explode a bomb and kill them. Those kind of things have made the battlefield a much more kind of unforgiving place to be. And some of the volunteers I've spoken to who've done several stints out there say that nowadays that the war there in the last year or so is not like the war that they fought in the first couple of years, and they're glad they did the fighting when they could or early on, because then they had a bit more freedom of movement and mobility as soldiers, and were basically able to put their soldiering skills into practice a bit more, whereas now it's becoming increasingly an automized drone war led primarily by drones. And if you're a soldier who's got infantry training, that isn't necessarily what you want to get signed up for, really, because it means you're facing a lot of risks. You've got very little agency, really, to do much.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things actually that came to my mind. Was I had a final question, but you've made me think of this one, which is simply, you said about technological breakthroughs, but the Flamingo missile, of which we've had Fabian Hoffman on to discuss that in specific detail. But what's your, when you've got Legion volunteers, are they able to make use of these equipment? Are they helping to train Ukrainian soldiers in certain areas, or it's more that they're following the lead of the Ukrainians?
I think there's a bit of both. Some of them are pretty much just there, almost as kind of Ukrainian regulars, not really doing anything, that's bringing anything particularly unique to the party other than themselves, which of course is important because an army needs boots and people. Some of the volunteers are very into the drone technology, and one of the volunteers in the book who had a background in computing and was therefore kind of quite IT literate. There's a chapter that describes how he experiments and innovates with drones and learns how to build drones that can drop grenades onto people, and fly something like 500 missions doing that, and in all likelihood has probably killed far more Russians than the average infantry soldier with his gun. The Ukrainians themselves are also very much taking the lead in terms of drone production and drone development. They have quite a big IT sector anyway, and I don't think the foreigners are playing a particularly important role in that. It tends to be sort of fairly localized help, really, that they give. But obviously, whenever you've got other nations in your army, especially well-trained soldiers, there's always something they can bring to the show, even if it's just in terms of things like ensuring that you've got a proper battle plan, ensuring that you've bringing adequate supplies and making adequate contingency plans if things go wrong, which apparently is something that the foreigners often used to find among the Ukrainians. They're not short of fighting spirit, but they don't always plan things as well as they might do, which is perhaps what you get when you've got an army that is suddenly thrown into war. They're not afraid, but they haven't always sort of dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's.
No, absolutely. And I guess the last question really is just simply looking ahead. We are probably in now for a longer military tactical element after this diplomatic flurry of August, which, well, most people knew it would amount to not much. What do you expect the role of these volunteers to be in looking ahead for the next year or whatever short to medium term, and how instrumental will they be, in your opinion?
I think they will probably just carry on largely as they have done. The Ukrainian military never says exactly how many are there, so we don't really have any idea of whether there is still the same number there or whether it's sort of dwindling force. I do think that there is an argument to be made that there's perhaps a bit of a lost opportunity, that if there'd been proper logistical backup for them and organisational backup, perhaps given tacitly by the West early on, the Legion could have ended up growing a lot bigger, and you might have had 50 or 100,000 soldiers out there, all volunteers from around the world. That might seem like a lot, yes, but if you think 35,000 joined up to fight in Spain, and I would argue that the Ukrainian war has been far better publicised around the world, and people find it far easier to communicate and travel and do all those things these days. I don't think that number is totally unreasonable. So it's a shame, perhaps, that's not happened, where you might have really had numbers that really could have made a difference on the battlefield. The other thing, in terms of their future role in Ukraine, I don't think it's necessarily going to be particularly pivotal either way. Where it might be more interesting to look at is whether they get the opportunity to pass their experience on to armies like in Britain and America, where there are now large cadres of British and American citizens who've got direct experience of fighting the Russians, many of them ex-soldiers, many of them who know what they're doing. As far as I can see, there's not much effort by the Ministry of Defence in the UK or in the States to tap into these people's expertise. I often make a point of asking the volunteers when I speak to them, the ones who've appeared in the book, sort of say, like, have you, since you've been back, has the MOD reached out to you? Anybody from your old regiment sort of said, can you come in and tell us what you know? What's it like to fight the Russians? What's it like to face these drones and the artillery and all just the general psychological onslaught that you must get from fighting a peer army? None of them have had any kind of invite of that sort. The odd one has been invited in by a pal, an old pal from a regiment. Come and have a little bit of a chat with the lads if you can. But there's been nothing put on any formal footing, which I find surprising, really, that the MOD would not want to tap into that expertise.
Yeah, no, that's certainly something that we could maybe see changing or improving in the months ahead, depending upon how savvy people are. But Colin, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining
You're
the
welcome.
program.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, and everyone, Colin Freeman, he is an expert on many different conflict zones and also now the author of The Mad and the Brave, The Untold Story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion. And well, you'll find a link to the book in the description below and in the comments as well. So do check it out. I look forward to seeing you hopefully again in person, Colin. Maybe we'll get together and do another live recording. But until then, everyone, thanks very much for watching. We'll see you soon.